Hello, I'm Randall Buskirk. I want to take a little bit of time to talk about a couple topics that are in the news a lot, or at least in uh, my news feed, whether it's in social media, magazines, newspapers, uh, trauma, trauma and panic and emotions like fear and anxiety, and the topic of stress. They all get lumped together into one big kind of dough of categories of emotions and physical health and mental health. So it might be helpful to separate it out and see what we can cook up instead of just one big blob of dough. Let's uh, let's try to make something tasty out of it. All right. So in that way of becoming more granular, as they say, about our terminology. Um, think of the word trauma itself. I was just reading something recently that seemed to um, talk about trauma as an emotion. Um, trauma isn't an emotion. So that clarification in itself can take you farther down the path toward better mental health and emotional regulation, I think. If trauma is not an emotion, okay, you're free, of course, to accept these definitions I'm offering as a licensed dynamic emotional integration trainer and consultant. I'm coming at it from that perspective, a system that I learned through working with Carla McLaren and that group of trainers and uh, books and materials and research that we looked at over the course of several years now. But any errors and incorrect and uh, um, misspoken words, they're all on me. Okay. So this also isn't medical advice or counseling advice, but it, we're in the world. We're humans. We've got our right to deal with things as well as the authorities. Okay. So a couple books that I might mention briefly here is the one is The End of Trauma. It's a nice little book, nice big book. How the New Science of Resilience is Changing How We Think About PTSD by George Bonanno. He's a psychologist and researcher at Columbia University. It's a nice book. I would recommend reading that. It's got a lot of good stuff in it. And he kind of talks about kind of conventional or classical accepted views of trauma and how research might show that there are other more evidence-based ways to think about trauma. And a second book is Trauma, the Invisible Epidemic, How Trauma Works and How We Can Heal from It by Paul Conte, MD, a psychiatrist also. This one, I got to be honest, for me right now, it's kind of a challenge to read it. It's got a foreword by Lady Gaga. It's endorsed by with blurbs by Carol Bayer Sager and Tommy Hilfiger. And I'm sure they've gotten great benefit from it. But I found this book really challenging with some of its approaches and terminology. Again, maybe in his clinical practice it works great. For me, picking this book off the shelf as a reader, um, the invisible epidemic. That's where it goes. It's something that's pervasive and inescapable. And so it's kind of that approach to it, as opposed to the end of trauma, which takes a slightly more, I don't know if you want to say progressive or positive approach, but nevertheless, that's my experience of it. Yours could be different. You could find it wonderful and helpful. But I do like how it starts out. I think he starts out on the right foot here with a definition: trauma, anything that causes emotional or physical pain and leaves its mark on a person as life moves forward. Anything that causes emotional or physical pain and leaves its mark on a person as life moves forward. I think we could start there and make progress. He, he offers a couple of analogies at the beginning of the book to help refine what his understanding of trauma is and how he's going to talk about it. It includes trauma as a virus, like COVID, there's a pandemic of trauma. He also describes it as pollution, like air pollution that you can't escape just because you're breathing the air. It's in the environment. Trauma is. He also talks about it like a parasite that it's just going to, it's going to mutate and invade us, and there's nothing we can do about it because it's just relentless in its will and hijacking our well-being. So trauma is this thing that's out there, and we have to deal with it. Bonanno's book, The End of Trauma, he talks about it, uses the term essentialism and says, well, maybe that's kind of an essentialist perspective on trauma as being this thing that has not been created as a concept by humans. But what I would like to do going forth is to think about another analogy with trauma. So he uses the analogies of the virus and things like that. So he talks about, of course, acute traumas and chronic traumas and various kinds of categories of trauma. But I thought it might be helpful to think of it like a sprained ankle. So a sprained ankle, of course, that's an injury. That's a physical injury. And the body has processes to heal that injury, right? It's got its own innate mechanisms meant to help you recover from that injury, that trauma, if you will. And sometimes we have a protocol that we'll use. If you've heard the RICE protocol, RICE, that's often the strategy that we will try to assist in our own healing from the trauma, from the injury of a sprained ankle. RICE is rest, Rest, ice, compress, and elevate. So that's often a strategy that many people use to help their sprained ankle. But now, if you look into it a little further, they're starting to say, or have been saying for a while, that that might not be the best strategy, that in fact, that might inhibit your healing, prolong the injury and the weakness, and not really improve your resilience. So I just looked up, there's another protocol. I don't know that this is the only one, but it's something called POP, P-O-P, an acronym for Protect, Optimally Load, in Pain Management. It's not really got a good rhythm to it, but that's what the article says. But it's interesting to think about this strategy in terms of a physical wound. Protect, first and foremost, with any injury, you protect it. Maybe it requires a sling, a brace, tape, whatever, something to protect the injury, the tissues while they're healing. So it talks about phases in the healing process. Optimally load is the O. In other words, start to challenge the tissues to, in the recovery process, be more active rather than rest. Sometimes it is good to rest, but very rarely. We know that people that are as active as able while following these two rules get better faster. When you're doing your activity, one, is it an acceptable level of pain? And two, do you think it will be worse the next morning? It's interesting to think about loading things optimally. And then the third one is pain management, which works to manage the pain in conjunction with the previous two steps. In other words, maybe you need to apply some icy hot biofreeze or lotions or heat or ice, but you're doing it in conjunction with the loading and the protection phases. So in the injury, blood comes in, heat comes in, lymphatic fluid comes in, white blood cells, nutrients come in, and it's rebuilding the tissue. And there's a time period that it has to go through to heal the tissues, to reconstruct them, and to get them kind of realigned into a more optimal loading kind of structure, tendons and all that stuff. So that's the analogy. There's this healing process that goes on naturally for a physical wound like that. So what if a traumatic incident or experience, whether it's acute or a long-term, is a wound to your emotional body, let's call it, your subtle body, your psyche, your soul, whatever term you want to use for that. Does nature have healing strategies, innate healing strategies for those kinds of wounds? Yes, they are your emotions. But many of us have been in a kind of rice strategy with healing our physical wounds, just like healing our emotional wounds, just like our now a little thing here is going crazy. Sorry, distraction from Zoom. So if you're applying a rice kind of strategy, a rest, ice, compress, and elevate, and you're not really recovering from the injury and getting back in the game, maybe a new strategy is called for. Relying on your emotions. If you've been suppressing your emotions, your healing responses, if you've been shutting them down, if you've been compressing yourself too much, what are the protective emotions and the reorganizing emotions and the all the benefits that emotions can bring to the healing of the emotional wound, the psychic wound. Okay. So the idea there is that emotions aren't the problem. Emotions are there to help you with the problem, which was the trauma itself. Okay. So this is part 2 of the video. One of your healing responses, one of your healing emotions is panic. Okay. Now it's helpful to distinguish panic from other emotions. It's usually confused or lumped in with fear and anxiety. But panic is different from those. Fear is just the emotion that helps you sense what's going on around you in the present moment. Be aware in the now. Anxiety is the emotion that helps you plan for the future. Okay. Panic is the emotion. It's a powerful emotion, a lot of energy that helps save your life in the present because there's a threat to your life. There's something very dangerous about a situation that your panic comes up to help you with. And it's also different from anger. Anger gets confused with panic because we've got that high energy kind of fight or flee response associated with it, or the fight response especially. And separate those out. Anger is another emotion. It sets boundaries and helps you be vulnerable and maintain relationships based on your own values and identity in relation to others. Okay. So panic, to kind of become more clear on it, I thought it might be helpful to look back at its etymology. I like to look at the roots of words and see what might be hidden in there that we can draw on as part of our nourishing, healing responses. So panic, the word itself, pan, comes from the Greek god Pan, P-A-N. So panic means to be of Pan, or like Pan, or pertaining to Pan. Okay. So what does that mean? What does Pan do? Well, Pan is this kind of mythic creature, half man, half human, half goat, usually. So to think about things mythically or experience mythically means we start to say, well, what does that represent? How am I like that character? Every character in the story, to use Douglas Brooks's way of talking about mythology. How can you look at it as you're not only the sheep in the story, you're those, but you're the forest, you're the god Pan, you're every element of the story. So how are we like Pan? How can we tap into that as a kind of a mythic divine power, if you will? So in the stories, Pan, he's not only this, he's this half human, half goat creature. All right. So there's whatever animal and human means to you, you're both of those. By tapping into your panic powers, you're tapping into something fundamentally expansive. You know, it's a power of nature you're tapping into. All right. And Pan has this because he's got this goat body. He's strong. He's super strong. You know how strong goats are. They can go anywhere. They can run. They can kick. Pan is really fast. Okay. So that ability to run fast is one of your panic powers. We say flee, and it gets disparaged in that way, but ability to run fast is a life-saving power. Whether you're running towards something to save someone or you're running away from something to save yourself or others. Okay. So the ability to run fast, to react quickly, that's a panic power that you need. What else does Pan have? He's got this ability. Let's see. He's impervious to injury. So in the moment, you need that panic power that kind of blunts your pain. You're impervious to pain in that moment when you need to perform this heroic act of rescue, perhaps, whether it's rescue of yourself or rescue of someone else. First responders, they're trained to panic well. They're trained to use their panic powers to serve the community. All right. So panic is for us. Pan is protecting the flock in a way, or his that energy is involved in the story of the sheep, you know, coming together too. So that panic energy is there that draws us together for support and aid. And he's got a loud voice. He can shout. In one of the stories, he intervenes by just a deafening roar that scares away the villain, the attacker. So if you've ever been in a situation where you were frightened, let's say, and you shouted like, it's not only an indication of, it's a protective response. It's meant also to frighten that person. Have you ever been around someone who emitted that panic shout, and your response was probably withdrawal? So when you're making that shout, that's a protective response to scare away the evil, the threat. Okay. Okay. What else does panic do? Pan, can transform objects into different forms. So it's a tool to turn something to your advantage. Maybe you're holding something and it becomes a weapon. For instance, he could teleport himself from Earth to Mount Olympus back. So in an instant, he could be on Mount Olympus, fleeing. That's a power. You go where you need to go to do the right thing to protect your life or to protect somebody else's life. So or dissociate. You can call it dissociation, but that's a panic power that gets you out of there. You need to get out of there, at least some aspect of yourself, your awareness. Get out of there. You don't need it, right? But you do need that power. So don't do a rice strategy and blunt your panic powers. Freeze. The ice strategy is one of those necessary. Sometimes it's the don't move. It's to become still. You need that too. So we want to label things, I think, as trauma responses and then say, oh, that's bad. I shouldn't do that. But think of trauma also, or I am anyway. You can think of it how you like. But trauma is this event that evokes a protective response. It's an action response. Take an action. And there are many actions that you can take. And if you let the panic energy be your guide, chances are you'll do the right one and you'll survive and you'll live to tell the tale. You'll live to tell the tale because you learned something from it. So traumas are and panic and all the emotions that come in to heal from the traumatic event, they're coming in to restore your psyche too. And what's part of that restoration of making it stronger and more resilient? It's a learning process. So all those chemicals that come in, which we label as stress hormones, whether it's adrenaline or cortisol or whatever it might be, they are coming in to help you take a life-saving action and to build more resilient tissues by learning and remembering what you need to remember and learn from that to get back in the game. So if you don't heal a sprained ankle, if you don't put it back into the game, you're just forever hobbled and on the sidelines. So if your strategies to work with trauma and panic are to blunt them and not let you heal and get back into your life, then rethink it. And maybe you need to bring in some of the other emotions that are part of the healing process. Does anger need to be in there? Does shame need to be in there? And shame gets a really bad rap in this book. So caveat emptor. You need shame, but you need to work well with it. You don't, it's like you wouldn't go take a whole bottle of ibuprofen for your sprained ankle. Okay. You don't need a lot of shame. Things need to be in balance, and they find their balance by working together. Use your fear, your anxiety, your panic, your shame, your anger, your confusion, your sadness and grief. All these emotions, they're just deep, intuitive, evolutionary healing energies that come in to bind together your soul again and make you whole and able to continue on with your life. So I don't know how long I've been talking, but I think I'm going to leave it at that and encourage you to honor your panic powers and all your other emotions as healing responses, as protective responses, as learning responses that allow you to go forward and continue to live a life you love. Good luck.